So I'm incredibly excited for us to start the panel. So the title of our panel is Engaging with Communities, Experiencing Health Inequities Best Practices. So we have an incredible panel set up for all of you today that I know we're all going to learn from and have incredibly insightful discussions with. So I'm going to introduce everyone very quickly so that we can get into it, because I know we could probably have this. We had a little pre-meeting last week, and I think we could talk for 5 hours on this, right, Angela? So yes. Great. So I'm going to start off. So I wanted to introduce Angela. So she's Algonquin, so Timiskaming First Nation Bear Clan. And she's the Associate Director at the Wakefinis Bryce Institute for Indigenous Health at the Dalla School of Public Health at the University of Toronto. As the Indigenous Health Lead for the Dalla School of Public Health, Angela oversees the new Indigenous Postdoctoral Fellowship Program. She worked for over a decade at the federal government in Indigenous initiatives. Angela is the director of the Masters of Public Health Indigenous Health Program and founding editor of the Turtle Island Journal on Indigenous Health. She works with Indigenous communities with issues related to Indigenous health, including cultural safety, land-based learning, climate action, and policy analysis and development. And she really is truly an expert in all of these areas. She also has a website, the AMP Lab, so the Angela Mashford-Pringle Lab website. And there's a lot of incredibly informative resources on that lab. So thank you on the website, for Angela's lab. So thank you so much, Angela, for agreeing to be our moderator today. And just very excited to have you here today. Next, I'm going to move on to Deepa. So Deepa is the Scientific Director of the Autism Alliance of Canada, where she works at the intersection of academia, policy, and advocacy. She's an adjunct research scientist at the Manitoba Centre for Health Policy and received her PhD in Community Health Sciences from the University of Manitoba. She's a 2-time CIHR Health System Impact Postdoctoral Fellow. And just to say that Deepa and I are co-supervising our postdoctoral fellow, Alexia, who I think was here earlier. I don't know if she's still on the line, but hi, Alexia. We're glad to see you here. Also, she's completing executive education at the Harvard Kennedy School in Public Policy and Leadership. So at the Autism Alliance of Canada, Deepa spearheads multidisciplinary projects that shape and inform autism and disability policy. She works closely with Canadian decision makers to inform the development of Canada's first national autism strategy. And her mission is to conduct high-impact health services and policy research and initiatives while promoting the full inclusion of autistic and neurodivergent individuals in Canadian society and allowing them to exercise their human rights. Next, I'm going to move on to Mahadeo. So Mahadeo is the world's first congenitally blind geneticist. He is the Vice President of Research and International Affairs and Chief Accessibility Officer for the Canadian National Institute for the Blind, having previously served as a researcher at the University Health Network in Toronto. Dr. Sukhai, is a leading expert on accessibility of graduate and postdoctoral research training in science, technology, engineering, mathematics, and healthcare disciplines. He is the chair of the Employment Technical Committee for Accessibility Standards of Canada, as well as the external co-chair of the Canadian Institutes of Health Research, or CIHR, Expert Advisory Committee on Accessibility and Systemic Ableism. Last but not least, Shamara. Shamara is a provincial epidemiologist for Prince Edward Island and an adjunct faculty at Dalhousie University. With over 15 years of experience in community-engaged research and over 10 years of experience in developing evidence-informed health policy and programs, she has built expertise in applying scientific evidence and engaging diverse public voices, which she draws on to mobilize knowledge for disease prevention and health equity. Additionally, she has advised organizations and governments on collecting data to address health inequities and monitor progress. She has received multiple honors for her community work, including a Queen Elizabeth II Diamond Jubilee Medal. So very pleased to have everyone, this fantastic, brilliant panel right now. I'm going to turn off my computer and shut up and let you all do your magic.
Well, I think we have lots of magic in this panel. So I have lots of faith that you will learn lots in this time. I had to stop everybody last week when we were talking because it was getting into great stuff. And I'm like, okay, now you got to hold this until next week. Um, and so I'm very certain that they will have lots to offer. Um, so I'm going to just reintroduce myself so that Andrea learns it's Temiskaming. Um, and Wakabanes. Everybody gets that one wrong, so don't feel bad. I've been working there now 6 years, and I don't think I've met anybody that's looked at it the first time and went Wakabanes. The two A's screw everybody up, I think. Um, so I'm from Temiskaming First Nation, but I was born and raised in Toronto. And so as an urban First Nations person, I often find that there's a lot for us to talk about when we talk about community engagement, because I'm not sure that people understand community engagement from different perspectives. And hopefully that's what we can bring you today. So I'm going to start off with the first question that I had given to the panel last week, and that's what was your experience as a person in doing community engagement work? And I'll start with you, Deepa.
Sure. Thank you so much. It's a real honor and pleasure to be here. The presentations have just been so empowering, so engaging and informative. And I hope that I can bring up, some value add to this incredible discussion. So Angela, I loved what you had said it last week about, talking about us from a person versus us as a researcher. And I'm going to and the way I'm going to do this is bring in a really deeply personal kind of journey I've experienced and why I started to do this work. So I was completing my postdoctoral fellowships. My PhD training was in using big data, the big data from Manitoba that you kind of heard about. I love that team, but we're using big data and we investigate issues in child and maternal health. And how do we take that big data to policy makers to inform policy? And at the time, I was working on using this big data to investigate the risk of kids developing neurodevelopmental disorders who were exposed to prenatal antidepressants and psychotropic medications. And while I was doing this work, my son was diagnosed with one of those very same complex neurodisabilities that I was investigating using this big data. And I suddenly found myself on the other side of the equation, on the other side of the table. And that was just an incredible moment. Suddenly, all the things I had heard about doing, nothing about us without us had an entirely different meaning and an entirely different purpose. And so I pivoted a little bit. I pivoted my career just a little bit to take all the research skills that I had and the big data skills and the policy skills that I had to look at how I could make a direct impact on changing policies at the macro level to create a more inclusive society. And how could I ensure that that work that we did, whether it was policy initiatives or research initiatives, was truly driven by the community and truly driven by the people who were living it every day. For me, I deeply acknowledge the privilege that my family and myself have to give our child the support that he needs to thrive. And I deeply recognize how fractured and broken our system is and how difficult it is for other families with less privilege to navigate these complex systems. So for me, that is, why I do this work and how I got engaged in this work. And as a person, and as a scientist, I spent a couple years grappling with how to present this lived experience, this lived connection I had to the academic community, because I was really concerned with, appearing objective and scientific objectivity and professionalism. And one of my mentors said to me, Deepa, there's no such thing as scientific objectivity. We all carry our own biases into the work that we do, whether we have lived experience in the fields that we're studying or whether we don't. And it really is about engaging in that important self-reflection that Carolyn spoke so eloquently about, and channeling that lived experience into the passion that fuels our work. And so that conversation set me free to confidently pursue this career path and work at the Alliance. And I'm honored to work with people across the country with lived experience, our board members, neurodiverse individuals, diverse individuals, staff, community advisory boards across the country, and I learned so much from them and truly am humbled by them each and every day and bring that to the work that we do.
Amazing. Thank you. Shamara.
Okay, so I came to this work many years ago. And so I originally grew up in the States, and I came to Canada to do my PhD. Well, initially a master's, and then the project became too big and rolled into a PhD project. But my main goal was I wanted to move knowledge into practice. So using research for program and policy development, I didn't know there was a field for that. I didn't know the language, any of that, but that's what I wanted to do. And I was introduced to community-based research by my supervisor, Greta Bauer, who worked with trans communities. So initially my work was going to be focused on community-based research with trans communities. And then when I arrived, I realized that there was a dearth of evidence around HIV in Black communities. There were not enough epidemiologists studying this topic, and so there was a need. And then I thought, well, I'm from Black communities. I'm studying to be an epidemiologist. Maybe there's something that I can do to help to fill this gap in knowledge. So I completely changed my research to focus on social determinants of health and how those impact HIV prevention in Black communities, and with a particular focus on Black communities in Southwestern Ontario, because there was no evidence there. We had some evidence in Toronto, nothing really outside, and a little bit in Ottawa, but really nothing outside of those two cities. And so I started on this journey, found mentors who were deeply engaged in community-based research, and built these strong relationships. And so even though I completed my PhD now 10 and a half years ago, and I'm doing the work that I originally went to do my PhD for, which is moving evidence into practice, so programs and policies at the provincial level. Like, I still remain engaged in community-based research, which is how I decided to have an adjunct professor position at Dalhousie University. So an appointment through which I could continue doing that research and have access to supports to continue that research. But it was really out of engaging with community and not wanting to be a helicopter researcher, where I finished my PhD and then disappeared. So I finished my PhD and got a different job working in provincial government agencies, using evidence to inform policy, and working in provincial governments, and then also continued essentially as a volunteer, continued to engage in community-based research and mentor people in community, and help people kind of develop their own skills. Tutoring people, that's something that I've done before, tutoring people in community who decided to go back to school and study and are taking a statistics course, and tutoring them in statistics. So just over the years, just completely becoming involved in community, being part of community, becoming a leader in community, supporting community, recognizing that the lines between my research life and my personal life is blurred, and my professional life is blurred. Also recognizing the privileges that I have in being in leadership roles in provincial government organizations, where I have a seat at tables where most people from my community don't have a seat. And I have a seat at tables in my province, and then also a provincial representative at a number of national tables as well. So I can bring these ideas around community engagement, and the ideas around health equity, and the ideas around race and health, and how race impacts health, how racism impacts health. I can bring those ideas to the fore. So I recognize that I do have that privilege. So I continue to do my work with community, and I continue to advocate in the spaces where I have some influence and power on behalf of community, and bringing the voices of community and the needs of community to the fore.
Amazing. So you guys have both said something that, so we've talked a little bit about helicopter research earlier, but both of you brought something up that I think is really, really important. Nothing about us without us. So when we talk about community engaged research, we often say that phrase. The other thing you guys have both talked about is privilege. The privilege it is to be the researcher in these spaces in community-based research, and mentorship Shamara, as soon as you started talking, I'm like, oh yeah, we forgot to mention that that's part of reciprocity, is to still now bring up the next generation of people who want to do this kind of research and mentor them so that they can get ready to do that kind of research, because you don't just finish the PhD and automatically know what you're doing. So there's a little bit of pulling up and helping and making sure that there's another cohort behind us to do, like, to build or advocate on our behalf. So Mahadeo, what do you want to talk about when you talk about your experience as a person doing community engaged work?
Thank you very much, Angela. Good afternoon, everybody. It's a real pleasure to be here with you and spend this time. I'm technically off work this week, but I committed to this session when Andrea invited me, because I thought it would be really important to come and spend some time and have a really fun chat with some really amazing people. So I want to. The reflection I'm going to share, it's going to sound a little bit peripatetic and rambly, but it actually it comes from I think a place of understanding that I wouldn't have gotten into community engaged research were it not for my career path. And that seems a little bit self-evident to say, but I'm going to explain why it's not. I'm a geneticist by training, and I'm also a person who was born blind. And those words, geneticist and born blind, don't go together in most people's minds. And so when I was in third year undergrad, I actually had a genetics prof who, when I introduced myself to her and said I was looking for accessibility supports in the classroom, she kind of just gawped at me like a fish for a little bit and said, "Wow, you're the first blind geneticist I ever heard of." Now this was 1996. It was pre-Google. And so that made it a little bit more difficult than today to actually figure out, was what she was saying correct? Because the problem was I didn't believe that it was correct. There's nothing in my educational career to that point that suggested that I should have been the first blind geneticist. But it turned out that I was empirically the first blind geneticist, not just at the University of Toronto, where I did my undergraduate degree, but in Canada, in North America, and around the world. And so we'll put to one side the psychological implications of what I just said, because what that ended up meaning was I had this really good career that I was attempting to build in genetics and then genomics and cancer diagnostics. And then there was this entirely parallel career that I was also building around, why was Mahadeo the first? And the way that I thought about approaching the question of why was Mahadeo the first was to actually understand the barriers within post-secondary education, particularly at the graduate level and at the postdoctoral level for persons with disabilities. And so I grew organically this parallel research career that ended up getting me really interested in understanding social determinants of health, understanding quality of life, understanding lived experience, understanding social and inclusion outcomes. And as I was doing that, my career in genetics got me into population data science and health services outcomes, and the use of large population data sets to tell stories. And for many, many years, those two things were completely separate. And the more that I was doing the accessibility in higher education research, which also became accessibility in employment research, I realized that, and this is going to sound this is going to sound incredibly arrogant, but I'm going to say it this way. I realized that everybody was doing it wrong. And I say that because we had all of these academic researchers, most of whom didn't actually identify as living with disabilities, who were carrying out research within spaces, and you wouldn't necessarily find researchers with disabilities as part of their graduate and postdoctoral teams, or within their collaborator networks. You may or may not have found project advisory committees. If you did find them, hopefully they were inclusive of persons with disabilities, but they didn't necessarily have to be. Remember, this was like 15 years ago, 2008. Community engaged research wasn't as well defined then as it was today. And you had all of these people doing it wrong. They were asking the wrong questions. And they were asking the wrong questions in the wrong way and not getting any advice to correct the issue. And yes, I was actually complicit in that myself. I actually remember one project where we were trying to understand the impact of financial barriers on post-secondary journeys for students with disabilities. And the lead researcher on the project, who is a good friend of mine, and I still keep in touch with him, and I really appreciate him. When we were scoping the project, the funder insisted, and the lead researcher went along with this, and I didn't push as much as I perhaps could have, and I was younger and more stupid back then. That we had to really focus on financial barriers for students with disabilities in post-secondary education. So we couldn't ask questions about living expenses, right? Except the fundamental problem was that yeah, people go to school, but people go to school while still living. We don't go to school in a vacuum, right? And so this once the final report got written, I was staring at it and I realized we'd made a horrible mistake. Not that the project was a bad project, it was a good project, but rather that we had made a fundamentally ableist assumption that just was not valid. And I was complicit in that. And you know, as I reflected on that, my perspective was, how do I make sure that never happens again? And so at that point in time, I was also on the national board for the CNIB, the Canadian National Institute for the Blind, and CNIB was going in a new strategic direction. And I started to hammer the point at the board level that we needed data. We needed data that we didn't have. And at first, the leadership didn't believe me that we didn't have the data. And I said, we don't have the data. We don't have the data. And everyone said, no, surely somebody must have done this. And we were looking for quality of life data on persons with vision loss in Canada. And the truth is that in 2015, those data were very hard to find, and certainly not at the population level. And finally, folks actually believed me that those data didn't exist. And then they said, well, okay, who can actually get those data for us? And in an act of colossal hubris, I said, well, me. And then one thing led to another, led to a job. But when I took the job, I had the chance to completely rebuild CNIB's research portfolio and research program. And the fundamental premise in doing that was that everybody was doing it wrong. And all of the researchers at the time, well, not all, actually, let me back up and rephrase that. 95% of the researchers at the time were asking the wrong questions in the wrong way and collecting data in the wrong way and not engaging persons with lived experience in their research governance and methodology. And all of this came to a head when I was at a conference 3 years ago at the height of the early part of the pandemic. And by the way, it's funny. It's just the most recent pandemic, but in cultural consciousness, it's the pandemic now. But you know, at the height of COVID-19, I was in this virtual conference and I was listening to a researcher talk about how researchers with disabilities just didn't exist, and persons with disabilities were too low functioning to understand research. So when you had an advisory committee of persons with disabilities, you had to dumb things down. And I found this horribly offensive on a million different levels. And I piped up during the presentation, you know, I beg to differ. I don't think it's true that you can't find researchers with disabilities. And he said, well, how do you know that? And I said, I'm a researcher with a disability. And that was horribly embarrassing for him. But that was emblematic, I think, of the conversation that goes on around how to do disability-focused research. And a definition that I would put on the table is that disability-focused research is research that is by, for, and with persons with disabilities. And often you don't find by, for, and with. You could find by, but not necessarily for or with. You could find for, but you may not find by and with. You could find with, but you may not find by and for. And certainly you could find two of those three, but it's very rare to find all three in one place. And then you've got this whole perspective of, well, how do you do research right? How do you make sure that the research that we do is accessible and inclusive, respectful? How do you make sure data collection strategies are appropriate, your consent is appropriate, your compensation guidelines are appropriate? And so this is actually how I got into this space. So the work that I do now is population data science, public health, quality of life, social determinants of health, inclusion outcome, right? But underpinning that whole thing is the principle that it's got to be done with the appropriate level of respect, with the appropriate level of accessibility, and the appropriate level of engagement. I am going to touch upon privilege for a moment, because I do happen to be in leadership spaces, and I do happen to have these conversations in leadership spaces. That's an earned privilege. It certainly wasn't there when I was born. It certainly wasn't there when I graduated with my PhD 16 years ago. But over time, this absolute bizarre thing happened, and that is that people seem to trust what I say and listen to me. And most of the time, I say something halfway decent. And so the privilege that exists today, it's not unearned privilege. It's actually earned privilege. But I also think about that privilege in the context of what it means for my 15-month-old who happens to be the beneficiary of her dad's and her mom's unearned earned privileges within these and other similar spaces, which ends up meaning that she, when she grows up and continues to come to awareness in the world, she's going to have unearned privileges that accrue from our earned privileges, which also kind of transform the nature of the conversation for her going forward. So just a reflection on earned and unearned in the context of privilege. I'm going to stop there before I keep going, because I think we're going to have.
That was fantastic. And I think you just kind of wrapped everything back together that everybody was talking about. Deepa or Shamara, do you have anything that you want to respond to anybody's comments?
Go ahead. Do you want to?
Okay. Yeah, thank you. Mahadeo, I really like the emphasis on with, by, and for, because I think it's so key. It's not the same as having being a researcher and then you've come up with a question or you've come up with a topic area, and then now you're recruiting members from communities or people with lived experience to join the team, or to serve in a community advisory committee. And that's perfectly fine in some contexts. But if you want to work with, if you want research that is with, by, and for people with lived experience or people from those communities, then people from those communities actually have to be part of the leadership structure. They have to be part of the governance structure. They have to have decision-making power in the relationship. The questions have to be questions that are coming from those communities, from those individuals. So you have to prioritize their questions and say, okay, I know that you have these particular questions. How can I help you? And it's a very different kind of relationship. It's a relationship in which you're asking communities how you can help them versus you asking communities how they can help you. And I would say in my journey, when I was devising my project, when I learned where the gaps in knowledge were, and when I was devising my PhD research and learning where the gaps in knowledge were, I actually came across an organization, the African and Caribbean Council on HIV/AIDS in Ontario. And they actually put out a strategy. And within their strategy, they identified research questions or research topics. So they identified where there were gaps and what kinds of information they needed to make decisions. And so I used that strategy to determine what I was going to study, how I was going to study it, with whom. So that strategy guided my research. And then I became very involved with that council and eventually joined their research committee, and then eventually became the chair of their research committee. But it was from making sure that my project, my work was going to be maximally meaningful to community, and ensuring that I was approaching community to provide my services instead of them helping me with my project. And that helps to build relationships, that helps to build trust. And over the years, and these are not just professional relationships, they started out as professional relationships, but they become personal relationships, they become friendships, they're like family. They're people who will be on a call together And someone will say a joke that is usually inappropriate in professional settings, but because of the group that is around the table and we've been working together for so many years, it's perfectly fine. And we all laugh. But it's that kind of relationship that we have, or someone's child, a friend of a friend's child is traveling, is moving to PEI for school. And then I get a call, well, can you check in on this person and make sure that they're okay? And kind of become their de facto on the ground parent in PEI, being their point of contact if anything arises. But it's those kinds of relationships that end up being built. And it's because it started with humility. It started with me approaching community and saying, I would like to be of service. What can I do? These are your questions. I will ask your questions. I will provide you with the information that you need to inform the initiatives that you're trying to move forward, and fill the gaps in knowledge that you have identified, not what I feel to be the gaps, but the gaps that you've identified as the priorities that need to be filled.
So Deepa, now what do you want to interject?
Oh, I want to touch on so many things, but I want to touch on, I love that being of service, and I want to build on that to say, so here's some strategies of how we at the Alliance, or how I try to look at it. I think it's my moral imperative to capacity build and to give opportunities for meaningful employment as well, and meaningful training opportunities for students, graduate students with disabilities who are neurodiverse, within the research and academic landscape. So we're huge champions at the Alliance of training neurodiverse graduate students and putting them within training platforms that exist, like the CIHR Health System Impact Fellowship, giving them opportunities where we have shared leadership, or where we just move right over and they lead projects. And I have to talk about this because just yesterday, or the day before yesterday, we submitted a giant report to the Public Health Agency of Canada that was led by one of our incredible fellows who's autistic, and he calls the report like autistic research led by autistic people, and just so proud to be part of a movement that can champion that we haven't seen in the research landscape at this level. The other piece is about that giving back piece. So for researchers who want to do this work and want to do this well, one of the greatest things you can do is think about how you use that research to empower the people who are on your team. So they may not always, there may not always be this direct impact to clinical service or policy that parents and people and lived with experience will want to see right away, but you have an opportunity to give them a stage to share their story and to use that work to, truly empower them. And so one of the examples is looping back to that project that Andrea shared that we're working on together at the beginning of the presentation, the international policy scoping review we did of international autism policies. And we had an incredibly talented woman who's autistic. And, she was right in there through the whole entire process, giving her feedback, contextualizing the results. And we got invited by the United Nations to present those results. And we, fought for the resources to bring her and her support person there so that she could present those results alongside our fellows in our research team. And she gave us feedback about how it was just empowering for her to share that space, to share that stage and tell her story on the international stage. So as a researcher, I often think about, where are those shared spaces? Where can I move over? And where can I, give this stage appropriately for the people who are impacted most by this work to share the work and tell their stories, and how to train them to do this work if they're interested in and have the skills.
So as you say that, like I have done, obviously, as Andrea pointed out, I've done a lot of research, but in the last 2 years, I've been working a lot with previously incarcerated Indigenous people. And if you didn't know, we make up almost 50% of all federally incarcerated folks in Canada. So when they get released, they also have problems finding employment and places to stay, or getting back to their community, or reconnecting with their families. And so having them come and be part of projects, it's so, well, first of all, it's eye-opening for me because they can tell me things that I can't see myself, but it's also you guys have already talked about this, but it's also that mentorship, because I can help them to decide what their goals are, and can I help them aspire to their goal. So it's really important. You guys have brought up one piece of community engagement that I think researchers often forget about, which is that give back piece, right? Mahadeo.
So there's another side to it. It's not just the give back piece. So as a scientist with lived experience, as I said, I was the first person in the world to have a to have a lived experience with congenital blindness who became a PhD in genetics. But I don't want to be the last, right? And so for me, there's two kind of cross-generational elements of service and giving back. One is for all of those trainees who happen to come through my hands and my team's hands, and I actually did a head count at one point. So when I started at CNIB Research, I knew that students would be important to the future of the research team. I didn't really have a good sense as to how. And in 2019, we only had a handful of students right before the pandemic. I think the number I could probably peg at less than 10, probably more around half a dozen. But the number of students who've actually passed through my team's hands in the last academic year is actually 50. And so we went from like 5 or 6 to 10 times as many during the pandemic. And you know, there's a story there for later, but I think it's really important to note that, you know, I have a research team that is 90% persons with lived experience with disabilities. If I include all of my consultants, the number is a little bit lower. It's not 90%, it's probably closer to about 70%, but it's still very high. And so you've got a research team of very qualified individuals, the majority of whom have lived experience, run by a person with lived experience. And that's a bit of a unique kind of enterprise. So how do you keep that going? You keep that going by finding the next generation of researchers with lived experience and cultivating them. You also keep that going by finding the next generation of researchers, period, and making sure that they know how to do this work well and they know how to do this work right. And I've had students who've come through the team who've really taken that message to heart, who've really had it resonate with them, who will today decide on career paths and jobs based on whether or not they feel the space is inclusive based on what they learned with us. And you know, I think it's really important to note, and you know, sort of the traditional academic mindset doesn't necessarily do this all that well, because the traditional academic mindset's very entrepreneurial and very long term, but when a traditional academic retires, what happens next is anybody's question, right? So what happens to your research when you retire? Who takes it over, right? But what we're trying to build is something that's very long term and very sustainable, and to some degree it's more of a movement than it is a research program. And you know, I think it's really important to touch on when we talk about how to do community engagement research well, when we talk about, and you know, I do believe there's right ways to do it and wrong ways to do it. And I've seen a million wrong ways to do it, which I don't encourage. And those the ones that I actually want to say let's not do that. But teaching that, I think, is really fundamental. It's part and parcel of what we need to do within this space, not just make sure that we're doing the thing, but we're also teaching others how to do the thing.
Well, so that gets to the next question I want to get to, and you can start us off, Mahadeo. Like, how do we, if I was a researcher, say, going to do work in, I'll say blind or vision studies, because that's not an area that I have, you know, any kind of disability. How would you meaningfully engage with the community with their different abilities? Because that's not my ability or disability. How would you meaningfully engage them? Like, what would you consider the best practice or the wise practice in engaging the community?
I mean, frankly, the self-serving answer is call me first, because then we can actually have a coaching conversation on how to do it. And I say that you know what? Yeah, it is a little bit arrogant to say it that way, and that's my own level of neurodiversity coming out. But but I think you're gonna, if we recognize that you've not worked within this space previously, and not you, Angela, but the global you, right? If you've not worked within this space previously and you're interested in asking a question that has to do with blindness or vision loss, right? Then I think fundamentally what you need to do is you need to understand, first of all, how you're asking the question, right? Is the question going to come across as horribly ableist? Is the question going to come across as disrespectful or disingenuous? The second thing you need to think about is, okay, if you're certain you're asking the question in a way that is respectful, then let's talk about what kind of engagement are we talking about? Are we talking about chatting with one blind person and using inductive reasoning to take the experience of one blind person extrapolated to the 1.52 million blind people in the country? Or are we talking about something where we're really saying, okay, we recognize that everyone has individual lived experiences through life circumstance and intersecting social identity. And so let's talk to a number of people until we actually reach saturation. Let's do a little bit of exploration, right? And then let's talk about, okay, once we've done that little bit of exploration, we've validated the question that we're asking is respectful and not insulting. Then let's talk about how we actually collect the data. Are we going to put inaccessible surveys in the field because people have done that? Are we going to back away completely because we don't know how to do it because people have done that too? Right? Are we going to have consent forms that are horribly written because they're like size 5 times New Roman font just to get it all on one piece of paper because we want to be sustainably green, right? And these are the things that I think are really important to think through. And often what ends up happening is researchers, all researchers do this to some degree or another. We accept the systems in which we live, and we don't question the systems in which we live. But fundamentally, when we're talking about accessibility research, anti-ableism research, community engagement research, you need to question the systems in which we live, because the systems in which we live were not built with community engagement research in mind. They were not built with disability-focused research in mind. And so I come back to my self-serving answer. If you want to make sure that you're not going to make an ass of yourself, pardon the expression, call me, right? Because at least we'll have a coaching conversation, and you can decide, is this something you really want to do, or are you not that interested in challenging the fundamentals of the system in which we operate?
Deepa,
Yeah.
go for it.
I am going to call you after this call so I don't make a jerk of myself, because I feel very much in the learning phase. But I really want to pick up on something that you talked about that I think about quite a bit, which is, how do we as researchers who are deeply passionate about this work overcome structural barriers to conduct this type of work? So how do we transcend the demands of productivity, academic incentives, all that stuff within the university, within the funding agencies that are funding our work, in a way that gives us the resources, the time, the ability to build the partnerships we need to do this well, the ability to find mentors who have done this well. So, a little bit of a call to action for the universities and for the funding agencies that are now seeing the value of this work and asking for this in grant applications and asking for this from researchers. Provide your researchers with resources and infrastructure support and time to do this work well, right? So one of the examples I have is I believe strongly in paying people for their lived experience and lived expertise, right? You are asking these people for their time from their work days, from their busy lives, from their children, from what they are doing. We are getting paid. They should be paid. It is a type of expertise. How do I build that into my grant? I've had ethics applications that say these are incentives, and they're lots of, I can go into great detail about this, but I won't. But how do we do this in a fair way? And how do we bring along the structures that support researchers along this journey to see the value and help support us in doing this important work? I don't have the answers. I'm hoping that other smarter people on the panel than me do.
I may actually
Yeah, me and Shamara might have some
Yeah.
answers for this, because in
Because I would
Indigenous research it's exactly that. But I'm going to let Shamara talk because I have lots to say.
And it's similar with HIV community-based research. So because of all of the advocacy that has been done as a result of community-based research, there are actually structures in place. So there's, with the CIHR, there's an HIV community-based research funding stream where it is perfectly okay to compensate community members for their time on research teams. And so we do that. And University of Toronto actually has a research ethics board for HIV community-based research. And I always point out those examples to show that it can be done. We can actually change research structures to support community engaged research. And so what I've been doing is I have the privilege of being able to sit in a number of different spaces as and influence some of the funding organizations that I interface it with as a member of PEI government. And so I have conversations with their senior leadership about how to foster community engaged research and what is needed to foster this research, how we can change the structures to support this research. So around providing community members with funding for their participation on research advisory committees for completing tasks related to the research, ensuring that the grant cycle provides, the length of grant provides time for relationship building because it takes time. Those community-based research or community engaged research more broadly takes longer because you have to build the relationships, you have to understand community, you have to understand the needs of community, prioritize the needs of community, and then you develop your research question. So saying we should be cautious if a researcher has not yet engaged community, but they're coming with a beautifully written proposal where everything is sorted out. They figured it all out and then they're coming with a proposal and they said they will engage community in future stages. Well, that's not community engaged. It's research with community, but it's not by community, and it may be for community, but community wasn't at the table from the very beginning, so from conception. I would say there are also there are a number of resources. There are now textbooks written about how to do community engaged research and how to do it right, because it's been around for such a long time. And for me, I remember when I started my PhD 15 years ago, and it was risky to do community engaged research, which is why I ended up doing a PhD instead of a master's, because you needed time to build relationships and it was risky. And some people thought it's not real research, it's not objective. And I read a quote, I was reading something and I read a quote and they said, there is no such thing as objectivity, there's just collective subjectivity. And we all bring our own biases to whatever we do. So to balance things out, you need people with different perspectives, with different biases, who are providing their opinions on a number of different topics. And then we're getting closer and closer to what's truth. And so I use that to empower myself and to think about my research and why I was doing research, and the communities I was researching and the perspectives that I was bringing to the table, and understanding that those were valid perspectives, they were important, and they were missing from the narrative up to that point. So it takes longer to build relationships. There's lots of resources about how to do this well around the best practices. And another thing that I've done is highlighting that the benefits of community engaged research are actually beyond academic outputs. It's beyond publications, it's beyond technical reports, it's beyond even the health improvements that we'll see in communities. It's really looking at changes that take place in community. When you have people who are now able to find employment, so they've gained, so the communities I work with, largely immigrant communities, with many people who are very highly educated, with who face employment barriers in the Canadian market. They don't have Canadian work experience, for example. And so providing that work experience. So we hire people from communities as project staffs or project coordinators, research assistants. We have peer research assistants. We bring in investigators, sometimes from other parts of the country, who are newer to Canada and are getting their footing, and we provide them with that experience so that they're able to build their resume. and maybe launch academic research careers or move into something else. But looking at those changes, and when we report on our grants, we talk about those outcomes, not just the publications, but we talk about the changes in community and the changes in community members as a result of being part of the project.
And so, Deepa, my 2 cents is in Indigenous research, I can't move forward until I have an Indigenous committee. So usually that's elders, knowledge keepers, and community members. And they usually tell me what I'm writing in that grant. If I go to get it, if we were in the States and I went to get a grant, so like the National Institutes of Health, the NIH grants, all of the money goes directly to the First Nation first, and then they pick the researcher. I'm waiting for Canada to catch up. CIHR needs to catch up because that makes the most amount of sense. When if CIHR is going to say or SHRC want to say they want people with lived experience research, then they should be getting the funding and they should be choosing the researcher or researchers who will work at the university level. But they should get the funding because they can also say, hey, we have to pay somebody for an interview and it's going to cost $200, and we got to pay them to come to the meeting and that's going to be $200. Like whatever the amount is, I'm just giving an arbitrary amount, but I mean, the idea is that what we're paying them should actually be what it's worth of their time. And we don't tend to do that. And that's problematic all to itself. I'm watching the chat and somebody had asked a question that I think I want to interject here because we might run out of time if I don't put it into our discussion. So how do we deal with involving people with lived experience in guidelines development where researchers aren't paid for this type of work? Do you guys have any thoughts on that?
So when I do my research, it's usually as a volunteer.
Thank
It's
you.
unpaid.
Take care.
And I contribute that expertise because I've benefited greatly from community to get to this point. So I can afford to do that work unpaid. Many of the people we work with from community are not able to do that work unpaid. And I hear that point quite often about researchers who maybe they're doing work that's unpaid, but saying, well, we shouldn't pay community for their time because no one else is being paid for their time. But the fact of the matter is, for many researchers, anything that you're able to put on your CV helps your career. So it's not direct compensation, it's indirect compensation. And we use the contents of our CV to advocate for pay increases, for promotions, etc. So in some way, researchers are being paid. For people with lived experience, they're contributing that lived experience, they're contributing that expertise. I don't see how you can even develop a guideline without the people to whom that guideline will be applied, without them at the table. And this is not something for most who ends up on their CVs that they can use for promotions and for pay increases, etc. So I don't see any kind of conflict around paying people with lived experience for their time, even if researchers are not being paid directly for their time.
Mahadeo.
So I think there's a fundamental problem in society at large, not considering engagement in these kinds of activities to be employability skills or anything of that nature. I actually recall being interviewed for a faculty position at an institution that I will not name in the western part of this country. And I had a faculty member bluntly say to me, all of this stuff you're doing around accessibility in higher education, accessibility in STEM, are you going to keep doing it when you're faculty? And if so, what's the point? Like, why are you doing it? Basically was the question that I got, which I thought was kind of offensive. I didn't get that job. I might have alluded to the fact that it was an offensive question when I was answering it. I don't remember. But I think fundamentally there is a challenge when participation in community engagement research isn't something that the participant with lived experience can feel like they can put on their CV or their resume, right? That's a problem. But that's probably another whole 2-hour panel. The other thing I think I would say is, I agree. There is no way to respectfully and inclusively do clinical guidelines without persons with lived experience. I fundamentally think that the shift that's needed is the shift in the definition of the term experts, right? Because right now, the definition of the term expert is based upon a hierarchy of academic credentials. The number of oncology fellows who used to think that they knew more about genome diagnostics than I did, who was trained within the space, was absolutely hilarious. But they had the MD and the FRCS and the FRCP, and I had the PhD, and there was a hierarchy between the two things that itself was offensive, right? And so there's a definition of expert that needs to include lived expertise, lived experience, right? Because so I'm fond of saying that the definition of user in any system is actually the wrong definition of user. The people who are considered to be the users of the system are not the patients, are not the caregivers, are not the persons with lived experience. They're actually the people who are interacting with those people. And so the end user is not the primary user. And that sounds like a philosophical kind of rabbit hole that Mahadeo's decided to dive down at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. But it isn't. It's a fundamental flaw of the system, right? And because that flaw exists, right, we have these conversations where people will say, well, the people who are using the clinical guidelines are the clinicians. They're the ones who get to decide what the clinical guidelines are, not the people who those guidelines will actually impact from a lived experience perspective. And I'm sure I've said a million controversial things in the last 30 seconds, so I'm going to stop there, and I know there's hands.
Well, first I'm going to let Deepa chime in before I get back to Yasmin, whose question this was.
Yeah, I don't know if this is going to answer the exact question that was asked, because I think the other panelists did a great job. But one strategy that we use to support garnering payment for really big projects that we want lots of lived experiences is to partner with not-for-profits, to partner with oh my God, what are they called? I need more coffee. To partner with charities who support this kind of work, who are passionate about this kind of work and have the funding mechanisms to do so without some of those bureaucratic barriers that academic institutions or whatnot have. And so, allyship between the community is so very, very important. And philanthropy can take, can really propel this space. And we're thankful for all of our foundation partners that have supported the work. And so it's also about how can you build those strategic partnerships between other folks that are working in the space, not necessarily traditional research spaces, but the more social justice spaces, and bring them all together to champion this.
So Yasmin, I know you had your hand up. Do you want to?
Yeah, thank you so much for asking the question for me and for all the answers. And I don't want to surprise you, but there are clinical guidelines that are developed without any patient partners. Where I work, we're trying right now to push more for this and to require that every guideline panel has a patient representative. But we are people are agreeing with the idea, but we always get asked how we're gonna involve them, what is the role, how they are going to be involved in the in drafting the questions or in drafting the recommendations. So we need some guidance around that, I think. And I see that Christine here has shared an article. Thank you so much, Christine. And thank you all for this great conversation, I have to say. Thank you.
Before I go to Ivan, I just want to pipe in, Yasmin, that I worked on the clinical practice guidelines for diabetes, and they chose me because I was an Indigenous scholar, but they didn't want to have anybody with diabetes there. And then I clearly articulated this to the people that were organizing the guidelines, And because they wouldn't change their mind, I quit because I'm like, I'm not putting my name on something that's unethical. And to me, it was unethical to not have people with lived experience be part of it. So it's just I think they have to rethink. And it's that Mahadeo has said it already. It's that power dynamic, right? That whole, I've got a PhD, you've got an MD, that the fight continues to happen. We could get into language and terminology and why we are called doctors as PhDs, but that's a whole other piece of things. Ivan, you had a question.
Yeah, hi everyone, not a question, just a comment. I'm trying to answer the question about how to involve patients in guidelines. So for some of you that don't know me, I have spent the last decade and a half working on guidelines. And I support organizations internationally in Canada, Latin America, and other parts about how to develop the best, methodologically speaking, the best guidelines. And there is kind of an agreement in the guidelines world that patients should be part of the development of the guideline, the recommendation. The problem is that most of the organizations, mostly societies, medical societies, are not prepared to do the shift into the process of doing guidelines that will have a participation, active participation of patients. So far in the guidelines world, we all know that patients should be part. The process of how to involve them is matter of research. There are many people around the world researching about the best way to do it. We have found many challenges. What is the best person to invite, or the best persons? What is the best profile? Should the patients be experts in the methodology at some point? How do you choose when there are many people interested? It's impossible to have representation of all the patients without the condition choosing one or two. So there are many alternatives to involve patients. We have done many of them. We have involved one or two representatives that at the same time are like a voice and have a contact with a group of patients. It is relatively easy when we have societies, advocacy patient societies, which kind of have the contact with many people with the disease, and it's easy to involve because the society kind of aggregates all these people. So, but in some diseases and in some conditions, it's not that easy because this association doesn't exist. So that is kind of the big role that we have. There is a lot of literature that I could share, and I could share with the SPOR team, that I could share with you, just to let you know that the Guideline International Network, which is the international society that groups all the people who work about guidelines, has a specific toolkit, which is called Patients and Public Involvement in Guidelines, and has a lot of expertise on that document that could be of help for some people who are interested, because it's not only about inviting people, but the way we invite and what is the role that they're going to have. In this the GENE toolkit, it's called the GENE Patient Public Toolkit. There are many experiences, and there are also some approaches that people could use. What I can tell as a physician that has worked for more than a decade is that professional societies usually don't invite patients because that will require more time, more expertise, but at the same time will require a little bit of losing their power on the process, on the development. I have done many guidelines with patients, and as a physician, I can say that in many cases, the involvement of patients is crucial to guide what is the final recommendation. So the experience of people who are work with this is always positive, but we need to work more and more with societies to involve patients as a routinely way to do it. But that's why we're working on increasing the method, the quality of the guidelines. So tools there are, we need to implement them, and we need to spread the voice that the methodology of guidelines is not only about synthesizing the evidence, but also hearing the experts. And when I say experts, I'm not talking about clinicians. I totally agree that clinicians think are the only expert, but patients are experts of the disease that they are living every day. So I can share the gene toolkit with the core team, so you can have a look, and you can share with the people who are more interested. So that's what I had to say. Thank you so much. Sorry if I extend a lot.
No, thank you, Ivan. Maureen's actually shared the toolkit already. So if you go in the chat, you can see it. Mahadeo, you had your hand raised.
The problem's the word patient. And I've just added to the list of egregiously controversial things that I've said in the last hour. But fundamentally the problem is the word patient, right? Because there is an expectation of what it means when somebody says the word patient, and encapsulated in that expectation is not the word expert, right? And so do we actually need to perhaps consider that the P in SPOR Evidence Alliance means something else?
That's a good point.
Can I pick up on that point for a second?
Yes, go for it.
You know, I think one of those fundamental principles is respect for your participants or your persons with lived experience, or which word we choose. And for the neurodivergent community, autistic people, the terminology you use to talk about autism is so very important. Autistic people tend not to want to be called, not want to say they have a disorder, right? So one of the very first things we did when I joined the Alliance was change our name from the Canadian Autism Spectrum Disorder Alliance to the Autism Alliance of Canada, with the support of our board and staff. Autistic people prefer identity first language. Some prefer person first language, or they would say, I have autism. And some prefer identity first, where they are saying, I'm autistic. So ask the people that you are working with what language they prefer to show that respect. With any community that you're working with. That's really the first step. And many communities don't want to be called patients either. So just looping back and picking up on that excellent comment.
So as you're talking about that, there's, at least for the Indigenous community, I'm just going to put it out there because we all have our terminology, but Gregory Younging, before he passed, had wrote a book called Elements of Indigenous Style. And so you capitalize Indigenous, you capitalize people. You know why we capitalize people? Because we're people, we're human beings. So you often see that people doesn't get capitalized everywhere. And it doesn't matter which group we're talking about right now. That's important. They're still a person. They still have feelings and beliefs and values. So we need to be very cognizant of that. One of the other questions we got in the chat that I hope that you guys can help with a little bit is, how do we get everyone on the same page with the definition of expertise? What would be the best way to make that happen? A certification, or should academics and PIs and people with lived experience have to show it, or how would you do that? I'm leaving it open. One of the three of you start.
It's like
Nice.
oh.
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, it's when I think about people with lived experience, and I think about the concept of a certification, well, there's no certification for being human. I mean, moving through the world, right? Each person is an expert in their own life. Each person who is living with a condition, whether it be a health condition or in a social condition, they're an expert in their own life, and they have a valuable perspective to bring. No physician has treated every single patient in the world, and that isn't required for them to be considered an expert in certain areas where they were trained. And so for people with lived experience, I think living with that experience is the expertise. And it's important to have multiple people with lived experience at the table. So you have multiple perspectives, and you try to maximize the amount of diversity you have within that group of people with lived experience. So very often there's probably 1 or 2 seats on a panel or on a committee for people with lived experience. And I would say, well, you need more seats. you need more people with lived experience, with more perspectives and more variance in life experience to contribute to the discussion, because no two people with lived experience are going to be exactly the same. So you need multiple perspectives. Also finding people ideally who are connected to organizations, if organizations exist, because they are bringing the voice, very often the voice of the organization to the fore, and that organization represents so many other people with lived experience. And if organizations don't exist in a particular community, then get as many people as you can. Even try to have 50% of your committee be people with lived experience. And that way you have a variety of perspectives at the table and no certification needed.
Right. I do think it's important to sort of, how do we get capacity built for our partners, and how do we use our resources so that to help them get the language that they may need to develop more of that common understanding between researchers, clinicians, and patient participants or persons with lived experience. So, for those organizations like mine that want to foster these partnerships, like what can I do or what can we do to, for those who want it, to offer some training or offer some resources or workshops, and that are really interested and invested in learning more about the research and academic space. Like, no certification necessary, but how can we help those who want more access to that sort of language that will help reduce some of the barriers to equal participation?
Mahadeo, last word.
Two things. First of all, the plural of person is persons. People actually mean something different. A people is a group of persons who share common background, common interest, common cause, common culture. And so the plural of person is persons, the plural of people is peoples. Sorry, again, neurodivergence. Those are different words with different meanings, but English is a silly language sometimes, and we use things in ways we shouldn't. When everybody's an expert, nobody's an expert. When everybody's certified, the certification is meaningless. And so I think it's not about certifying. I think it's about recognizing that everybody knows what they know. There are 1.52 million blind or partially sighted people in the country, or persons in the country. That means there's 1.52 million individual lived experiences, 1.52 million individual sets of expertise based on what those lived experiences are and have been. And so I think we need to reconceive, because the challenge with the word expert is the same challenge with the word patient, just in reverse. There's a power dynamic associated with it, right? Everybody's got lived and professional experience, and those lived and professional experiences come together to define and illustrate what we know and how we know it, right? And really the conversation is about bringing together the right teams who all know complementary things in order to do the work that needs to be done, right? It's a huge philosophical shift, because we love our power structures as human beings. We've loved them for 150,000 years, right? We're not going to give them up tomorrow, but we should.
Okay, so I'm very cognizant we have 2 minutes. I'm going to use the last 2 minutes to just wrap us up a little bit. So we talked about so many things in the last hour, and believe it or not, it has been an hour. It didn't take us long to go through that time. Language is a key problem that I know, at least in my spaces with Indigenous peoples, because we're not one big pan-Indigenous group. We're made up of a whole bunch of different cultures that people put the label of Indigenous people on. And I think that we also need to remember that when we're doing work with people with lived experience, or peoples with lived experience, maybe that's the way we should be putting it, mentors, supports to community are absolutely necessary. Nothing about us without us. So the whole idea that people with lived experience should be in every aspect of every part of our research. That's what the SPORs were created for. And that's where we have to push. This is where our advocacy comes in. And I think that we all have privilege. That we're sitting here at the SPOR today shows our privilege. I know you're probably going, how is this privilege? We're sitting in a 4-hour meeting. But that's still privilege that we got to come and sit in a 4-hour meeting and we didn't have to worry about our food or working hours or doing something else, looking after doing caretaking duties or other things. So that is privilege. And I speak a lot about earned and unearned privilege. My big thing is the 3 Ps, and it's the power, the privilege, and your positionality. And we don't think enough. And most people think they have no power. You have lots of power. Your words are power. Your actions are power. The things that you do are power. The things you purchase are power. You know, I always tell my students, you got one of these sitting around, you know, the little Apple thing. A little Apple thing tells me that you're giving money to Apple. You go and purchase your groceries from Loblaws, you're giving your money to Galen Weston. Yes. It's important to remember what each and every little thing you do as a person does to contribute to colonialism, to community engagement, to having more appropriate research now and into the future, as Mahadeo had already illustrated, we need to think about. In my culture, we would say we need to look at the 7 generations. So 3 before us, our own, and 3 coming up. And that's how I'm going to end it. Andrea, I'm handing it back to you now. Thank you so much, Deepa, Shamara, and Mahadeo for all of this wonderful conversation this afternoon.